4 games into the series, it looked like things were all over for the Toronto Maple Leafs. Now we're headed to Saturday night's Game 7 in Boston to discuss that and how we got here, how the Leafs turned things around. Here's our hockey insider, Darren Dreger. Dregs, let me start by saying this. I realize the Toronto Maple Leafs absolutely desperately want Auston Matthews back in their lineup. But in his absence, let me ask you this, because I got a theory about this. Has the absence of Auston Matthews unlocked the Leafs' entire new understanding of what it takes to win come playoff time? And then you're left wondering, man, if they know how to win without Matthews, imagine if and when he returns. Yeah. Do you think his absence has helped them to discover the way to win in the playoffs?
Well, only in the sense that other guys have accepted more responsibility, right? And have been given bigger opportunity, not just with Auston Matthews. I mean, we heard from Sheldon Keefe post-game after Game 6 talk about Matthew Knies, Gino, and how he's elevated his game, maybe because of the chance of being in that top 6, comfortably in the top 9 with Bobby McMann sidelined with the knee injury. Bobby McMahon's second half of the regular season had really made strides. He was an impactful player, and that pushed Matthew Knies down in the lineup. You know, obviously Toronto is better with a healthy lineup, which includes Auston Matthews and Bobby McMann. But Max Domi has been unbridled. He has been terrific. We've seen him seize the opportunity. The chemistry that he had with Matthews, he now has with Marner. And let's give Tyler Bertuzzi some credit there as well. So it's not just about the individuals here. It's by committee. And that's what's been most impressive through Game 5. And then again, they duplicated that effort in Game 6. And while we're giving credit, let's give some credit to the head coach, Sheldon Keefe. I thought it was a relatively bold decision to park Ilya Samsonov going into the third period of Game 4. He opts for Joe Woll. The team plays better, but then they find a way in Game 5 to play a complete game, detailed game, defense first sort of game. And they carried that over, again, on the back of Joe Woll into Game 6. So it's almost like a switch has been flipped in this series against the Boston Bruins, whereby, I'm sure the coaches preach this all year, but whereby the players in the Toronto Maple Leafs realize that you don't have to outscore your opponent by 2 or 3 goals. You got to play the right way to win, especially this time of year.
And you know what? You talked briefly about special teams. I want to follow up on that. First and foremost, though, let me ask you about Auston Matthews. Do we think he potentially plays Game 7, or is he a write-off for this series?
Well, I'm not in a position to say he's a write-off. I'm going to go back to what I said on SportsCenter just prior to Game 6, and that there is a belief that there's a slim chance that he'll be available for Game 7. It was interesting that Sheldon Keefe so swiftly prior to Game 6 acknowledged that Matthews was not going to be available for last night's game. So let's see how they approach going into Game 7 on Saturday. Again, whatever Auston Matthews is dealing with, we know it's injury. We believe that he's over the illness. It's up to Matthews. If he feels well enough and he can convey, Gino, that messaging to the medical staff, the doctors of the Toronto Maple Leafs, then I suppose there is a chance that he could re-enter this series and perhaps be a factor in Game 7. But I think more time is required. There wasn't a whole lot of optimism going into Game 6 that he would be ready if there is a Game 7. So maybe the magic, the miracle of modern medicine will get Matthews back in for what will be undeniably a pivotal game.
Dregs, you and I spoke after Game 4 when the Leafs fell behind 3-1. It looks like they were toasted. They didn't really show any life, really, that made you think they had a chance of getting back into the series. And you and I, when we spoke at that point, you were talking about the fact that it looks like Sheldon Keefe could become the victim of the Leafs yet again, another failure in the postseason. The Leafs may be forced to trade a blue-chip talent, maybe even a Mitch Marner at that point. It's not over yet. We still got Game 7 to play. But given what the Leafs did in Games 5 and 6 and forcing a Game 7, has that potentially shifted the thinking upstairs in the Toronto Maple Leaf brass?
I think it's still too early for that, Gino. The heat is off a little bit. But the Leafs haven't won anything yet. All they've done is extend the series. And again, Keefe in his post-game remarks was asked about coaching in a Game 7, and he said, look, I feel like I've been through that already in Game 5 and 6. being that they're both elimination games. So I think that you have to look at the history and not just, current events of this best of 7 against the Boston Bruins. And unfortunately, if the Toronto Maple Leafs lose Game 7, no different than the Boston Bruins. You don't think that Jim Montgomery is going to come under fire in Boston if Toronto prevails? Of course he will. I mean, you're in the business of winning. It's just the heat is probably hotter in Toronto than it is in Boston. And that's maybe because of the history. Sheldon Keefe has been given multiple opportunities to guide this team over the hump. That's not just winning a round or winning a second round. That's getting the conference final. That's getting the Stanley Cup final. That's being a top Stanley Cup contender. So if they fall in Game 7, even if they make it to Series 2 and they fall to the Florida Panthers, I think that there's still going to be some serious consideration by Brad Treliving, maybe Brendan Shanahan, as to what needs to change within the group. Could it be a coaching change? Of course it could be, with experienced guys like Craig Berube out there, Todd McClellan out there, go down the list. What about the core? This core hasn't won anything yet. You've got, again, a core of 2, and that's Matthews and that's Nylander. So, is it time that you hit that core and consider moving the pieces like Marner or John Tavares, the captain? Is there a captaincy discussion that has to happen at some point in the offseason, again, fueled by disappointment? I think all of that has to be considered, despite the fact that the Maple Leafs have moved the needle here in favor of doing little, based on the fact that they've at least extended this series and have chased it into a Game 7.
All right, you brought up Jim Montgomery. I want to follow up on him. He said after the Game 5 loss, he said he was pissed about the way things unfolded. If he was pissed at that point, I'm guessing he's a lot angrier right now. And he's also been pretty vocal. This is 6 straight games they've had an opportunity to clinch and advance in the playoffs, and they're 0 for 6 in that stretch. So he's under the gun as well. He had the harsh comments about Pasternak. Pasternak started well in this series, but then he has really struggled in the last 2 games without a single point, not a goal, not an assist. And then Montgomery threw out that Pasta needs to step up. What do you think of what Montgomery's dealing with right now in Boston? And what do you think of what he's got to say about Pasta?
Yeah, no, I think it's fair game, though, Gino, because, again, you don't just take the end of the statement that he made post-game. He was specifically asked about his top players and specifically asked about David Pasternak and what he has to do more of. Pasternak historically has been a Toronto Maple Leaf killer. In this series, that hasn't been the case. Brad Marchand, early in the series, okay, he was impactful. The last couple of games, less impactful and more sort of agitated by the game that the Toronto Maple Leafs have been playing. And twice, once in Game 5, again in Game 6, Gino, we saw Jim Montgomery go to his captain on the bench to either get him going or in Game 5 to cool him down. Brad Marchand and David Pasternak are Boston's 2 best players. If they're not capable of playing like their 2 best players, then clearly Montgomery and the Boston Bruins are in trouble. But specific to the comment made on Pasternak, I think that was the head coach just responding to a very specific question. However, we just talked about the heat on Sheldon Keefe and whether you could see change to the core of the Toronto Maple Leafs if things don't go their way in Game 7 or they're dispatched by the Florida Panthers in round 2. Shouldn't we or could we have the same conversation about Jim Montgomery and the Bruins? I think that's fair game. Look, the expectation in Boston is equally high. Go back to last year. They led the Florida Panthers 3-1 in round 1 of the playoffs after having a terrific regular season, and they got dumped in that series in Game 7. Well, rewind and hit play, because that's the environment they're in again. So if you're Cam Neely or you're the Jacobs family, the ownership of the Boston Bruins, and your team falls in a 7-game series back-to-back after leading 3-1, aren't you asking the tough conversations or the tough questions and having those difficult conversations? I think that's just par for the course and what it is all about in being in this position in a real tough world.
There you have it. The stage is set. Both the Bruins and Leafs organizations desperately trying to exorcise some demons of the past. And it all comes to a head in Game 7 in Boston Saturday night. Our hockey insider, Darren Dreger.